This chapter is all about setting the tone, both for the Dawn Brigade and for Radiant Dawn as a whole. The sheer difficulty of the chapter is what sets the tone for the game as a whole. Radiant Dawn is one of the most challenging games in the series, and this chapter is the first to really establish that. It is nearly universal in Fire Emblem games released in the West that the player gains access to a nearly invincible paladin before any real challenge is presented, also known as the Jagan archetype. Marcus from Blazing Sword, Seth from Sacred Stones, Titania from Path of Radiance, trope namer Jagan from Shadow Dragon, and Frederick from Awakening all take on this role. More recent titles have been a bit more flexible on this point. The early chapters of Fates jump around a lot, though Gunter does fulfill the role for a couple chapters, including the first chapter to provide any real challenge. And while Lucas is neither a paladin nor the offensive powerhouse that most Jagan-type characters are, he is nearly invincible and quite capable of soloing early chapters in Shadows of Valentia, albeit much more slowly than the paladins. Radiant Dawn throws the player a much bigger curveball than either Fates or Shadows of Valentia, however. While Nolan is no slouch, and is undeniably essential for completing this chapter, he is far from invincible, and falls well short of both the offense and defense provided by the aforementioned characters. He cannot be asked to clear the area by himself the way those characters could. Yet Micaiah and Leonardo are made of tissue paper, and Edward isn't a whole lot tougher, so the player must make very careful use of several key choke points to avoid being overwhelmed by enemies, since Nolan can't tank them all. On top of that, this chapter has an escape turn limit, which forces the player to think creatively about how to advance, rather than turtling in the starting area and slowly whittling enemies down one by one. The escape turn limit is a very unusual mechanic within the series. In fact, I'm not aware of any other instances of it being used prior to Fates. In this chapter, it not only helps set the tone in terms of difficulty, but also in terms of the aesthetics of the Dawn Brigade. Despite being a lowly mercenary company, right from the start of Path of Radiance, the Grail mercenaries have an air of competence, experience, and professionalism about them, which is why they were consistently underestimated by their foes, and why putting the inexperienced Ike in charge was jarring for some of their members. The Dawn Brigade, in contrast, is genuinely a ragtag group, with less experience, fewer members, and fewer resources. There are no former Royal Knights, much less Riders of Dayan, among their ranks, as there are with the Grail Mercenaries, and the one member with any real military experience is off somewhere else for this chapter. It is appropriate, then, that this chapter creates a sense of desperation. The Dawn Brigade faces a larger, stronger, better equipped foe, and they need to keep moving rather than engage that superior foe head-on. A less difficult chapter, or one with no turn limit, might undermine the urgency and frailty of the Dawn Brigade's situation. As it is, I'd argue that the gameplay of this chapter does a better job of setting the tone for the Dawn Brigade than the dialogue. There are a few other interesting design choices I want to call attention to. The first is the placement of the soldier with the javelin immediately in front of the church containing the hand axe. While Micaiah has a 1-2 range weapon, it might as well be 2 range because she does not want to engage in melee combat, and no one else in the prologue has a 1-2 range weapon. Putting a soldier with a javelin in front of the church gives the player the opportunity to see the value of a 1-2 range weapon on a unit with the durability to take advantage of it. After visiting, the player gets a hand axe, giving them the opportunity to try out a 1-2 range weapon for themselves, potentially by counterattacking the archer in the upper left. The second thing that I want to call attention to is the placement of the house with the vulnerary. Like Leonardo's Draco Shield, this one just confuses me and is my one quibble with this chapter. The house seems like bait. It isn't worth visiting just for a vulnerary, given how out of the way it is. But this chapter comes too early in the game for something as tricky as a bait visit tile. In fact, I'm not actually sure that's something the designers ever intentionally do. Minor quibble aside, overall, I love this chapter. I love how quickly Radiant Dawn becomes challenging, I love the sense of urgency, and I love that there is already an extra objective in the form of ensuring everyone escapes before Micaiah for maximum bonus experience. Like many of Radiant Dawn's best chapters, this one finds a way to challenge the player creatively, rather than just throwing hordes of raw stats at them, a la Path of Radiance Maniac mode. and that's just another way that it sets the tone for both Part 1 and for the game as a whole.